So I want to think about what each of these characters in the Christmas story represent. I wonder what you think Mary represents in our lives. There are many references to women, special women, through the Bible. They're often used as a symbol of something. They're often used as a symbol of the church. I think right at the very end of the Bible, there's that vision of the holy city descending from God out of heaven. And do you remember how it's described? Adorned as a bride for her husband. Also in the book of Revelation, there's the woman clothed in the sun who gives birth to a male child. You go into the Old Testament and there's other references to women. Particularly, I think of the book of Proverbs, which we don't read very much, but in the book of Proverbs, both wisdom and foolishness are described as women. And in the very last chapter, there's that chapter about finding the faithful wife, if you've ever read it. But actually what it's talking about is finding wisdom and directing one's life according to wisdom. So Mary represents the church within us. And another way of putting this, as Swedenborg often describes it, is the affection for truth. And that is an affection for truth which is interested for truth in its own sake, not for any other reason than that it is true. That's what Mary represents. And I just also notice about the story that it says the angel comes to see her in the 6th month. Now, the number 6 is an interesting one. We have the 6 days of creation, don't we? It's very much like the way that much of the Christmas story occurs at night. We're talking about spiritual work taking place here. This is what I hear as I look at the story of Mary as she comes into the Christmas story. Now, we're going to think about Joseph. If Mary represents the church, the affection for truth, what does Joseph represent? Interesting thing about Joseph is there's another Joseph in the Bible, isn't there? And that other Joseph is also known in some way because of his ability to interpret dreams.
Yes.
And the dreams that he himself had, which is an interesting connection to make, isn't it? The angel also appears to Joseph, but appears to Joseph in a dream, whereas Mary has seen the angel in a state of wakefulness. She's been awake and she's actually had a conversation with the angel. There's something else interesting about the story of Joseph and his encounter with the angel. Which one of these do you think occurred first? Was Mary the first one to be approached by the angel, or was Joseph the first one to be approached by the angel? Why do you say that?
Because then it says she was found to be with child.
Yes. So Mary is told she's going to be pregnant. Joseph sees the angel after Mary is found to be pregnant. So in time, it is Mary that sees the angel first, and it's Joseph that sees the angel second. But in the way the story is presented in the Bible, it's actually the other way round. Because the story of Joseph seeing the angel occurs in the Gospel of Matthew, the first Gospel, whereas the story of Mary occurs in Luke. And that's the way round we've got to think about it if we're talking in terms of the representation of the characters. I'm going to suggest that Joseph represents the understanding of truth, whereas Mary represents the affection of truth. And here's what I see here. When we grasp truth with the understanding, it is often obscure. We are unsure about it. It's something that we can accept it as true, but we don't really understand its full implications. It's only when we grasp it with our affections and we seek to implant the truth in our life and carry it out in our daily actions that the truth actually becomes alive and we become awake to it. So, what's a manger?
Feeding trough.
It's a feeding trough, isn't it? Okay, so no room for the family in the inn because everybody's come into town for this great census that's taking place, and all they can find is a stable, and they lay the baby Jesus in a manger, which is a feeding trough. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's the correspondence of a feeding trough. What is it? It's something that nourishes, isn't it? It's somewhere where we find sustenance. Now, we're not talking about for our bodies. We're not talking about having breakfast, lunch and dinner. We're talking about something for our minds, where we find sustenance and something to help us grow spiritually and mentally and psychologically. So Emanuel Swedenborg wrote this: the manger where the shepherds found the infant Lord symbolised spiritual nourishment. And he goes further than that. He says the fact that they're unable to find room in the inn signifies the way that Jesus, at the time of his birth, was not accepted by the church of the time, the people at large. They were unable to recognise who he was. And if we read through the Christmas story, we see that very clearly, that the Lord, despite all the prophecies about him, were generally speaking not recognised by most people, and certainly not the people in power and the people in religious authority. And so, of course, the Lord who comes into our life, what does he represent? What does the baby Jesus represent? The Word, which is exactly why I've put it right here. Yeah? So this is the Word come into our life, the source of our spiritual nourishment. So I wanted particularly to think about the star. Stars, Swedenborg tells us, refer to knowledges from the Word, which is quite interesting, given who these three men are. They're not members of the Jewish establishment. They are people from far away. They are wise men. We might think of them as scientists of their time. These are the ones who come seeking the Lord. These are the ones who come seeking divine truth. They go first of all to Jerusalem, which is the logical place to go if you think about it. It's where the temple is, it's where the rulers are, it's where you would expect a king to be born, it's where you would expect there to be religious knowledge. And they are able to come to and talk to these men and say, oh yes, we can see from the Bible X, Y and Z. But they do nothing about it themselves. Sometimes those who are closest to the truth are the ones who are least prepared to see it. It's a real challenge to us. I can speak for myself, as some of you are also, born in the church, grown up in the church, and we kind of have it's always been there. It's been a comfort and it's been something that we've enjoyed, but sometimes we miss some of the really important details that it shares with us. And it's someone who comes from outside who reignites, I suppose, our fascination with the truths in the Word. With that reference to the star in Matthew's Gospel and the story of the wise men, the thing to remember, if you look at Matthew's Gospel in particular, that is the Gospel that is so keen on quoting the Old Testament and making a connection with the Lord through it. So I think it's particularly, that's why it's in Matthew's Gospel, in the story that Matthew relates about the Lord's birth, because it looks back at the Old Testament word and it sees the Lord. As we have in the Psalms, the heavens declare the glory of God. There are the wise men looking at the heavens and seeing what they can see that we who are closer to it sometimes miss. And it reminds me of some of the scientists in our modern world who reopen our eyes to things. I've got a book here called Proof of Heaven, and some of you know this, by Eben Alexander. So he is a man who was a neurosurgeon who visited heaven, and he uses his knowledge of the human brain in describing what he does and how he supports, and he understands things like he knows what delusion is. He talks in this book about suffering delusions as part of his recovery journey, but he knows that what he saw in heaven was not a delusion, it was real. So here is one of my wise men, if you like, Eben Alexander, and of course there are many. I think of names like Pim van Lommel is another one, and also Emanuel Swedenborg, a scientist who shows us so much about what is present in the Word. Now, of course, they bring gifts. They bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When we read the Bible, often things occur in twos and threes. And it's a real clue for us in terms of what they mean. So twos often refer to what is good and what is true. In the same way that Mary and Joseph, Mary refers to what is good, the affection. Joseph refers to the truth, an understanding of the truth. So there's a pairing. Threes add another element to that. You have what is good, what is true, and what is of action, what is done, what is of use, we say. And so the gifts they bring are the gifts of the heart and of the head and of the hands. The affections, knowledges, and actions carried out. What is it you might bring to the Lord of your heart, of your head, or of your hands? And this Christmas, perhaps you might think about what you're looking forward to about Christmas. Or you might even bring something of a sadness if you carry a sadness, something that you would bring to the Lord this Christmas.